Hadara Bar Nadav is the author of A Glass of Milk to Kiss Goodnight, awarded the Margie Book Prize, The Frame Called Ruin, runner-up for the Green Rose Prize. Her latest book is Lullaby with Exit Sign, which was selected by Lynn Emanuel for the 2012 Saturnalia Books Prize. And she has a chapbook called Show Me Yours, which was awarded the Midwest Poets Series Prize. She's also the co-author of the textbook Writing Poems, the 8th edition, and she's currently an associate professor of English at the University of Missouri, Kansas City.
Yep.
So, yeah, quite a list. Racking them up.
And growing.
Yeah, exactly. So awesome. Well, I know that you've been getting a lot of attention for your latest book, so I thought we could start out talking about that.
Sure.
And it came out this past spring. I was curious if you could talk about what the most surprising thing was for you when you wrote this book. What surprised you about this manuscript?
That it was a book. And what I mean by that is a little bit of backstory. My father passed away after struggling for 20 to 25 years with Lyme disease in August 2007. And 2 weeks prior to that, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And I was flying back and forth to help her with surgeries. I had just moved to Kansas City and started a new job. And the end result of kind of being consumed by all this grief and facing the mortality of my parents was that I stopped writing entirely. And this went on for about 4 months. And I finally decided I would experiment with giving myself an assignment, a writing prompt. And it's actually a writing prompt I give to my creative writing students on a regular basis. If you're stuck or you're having your writer's block or whatever, take a line from a favorite poem, throw it at the top of the page and use it as a jumping off point to continue. And so I took the exercise on myself, and I had really been inspired by Dickinson herself, who wrote all these really elegant, eloquent poems about grief, and not just one and not just 10, actually hundreds of them. And she sort of was an example of how you can write through death, you could write through grief. I didn't know it was a book. That was a surprise. I started with one poem called Compose an Evening Sky. And, a day or two later, I sat down and I thought, well, let me try this again. And I had another one, and then I had 6, and then I had 12, and then they kept coming, and I didn't know what they were. I didn't know if it was a section of a book or a chapbook, or who cares that my father died and my mom has cancer. So I also, I really struggled with how to find a way to make the elegy a potentially shared experience with the reader, not just my own processing of grief. And there were definitely poems that did not make the cut, that I just didn't think moved to a kind of shared experience with the reader. But that's what I hoped for in the end. There's so much silence surrounding grief. My hope is, people, that you can commiserate with the work in some way, find some comfort, some solace, maybe.
Yeah.
So, surprise, it was a book. Did not know that.
Yeah, I think I would, maybe we could talk about that some more. I think when you've talked about this book before, you've talked about how you really scraped away at it and really edited it. And I think that editing process really did make it so that all of the poems are a shared experience with the reader. Because I think they're so well edited, I feel closer to them. Can you talk about that editing process?
Sure. I can say that for this particular book feels very chiseled to me, and in part that's because each poem and each sentence felt so hard won. Initially, writing seemed ridiculous. Writing wasn't going to cure my mother of cancer. It wasn't going to return my father to me as a whole person. It seemed like an absolutely futile act. And also, I've heard other people talk about this. Grief for me was very tiring. I was very bodily tired all the time. When it came to editing, it was sort of, for me, kind of easy to see where excess was happening. And it did feel like a scraping away and a scraping away to what was essential. These poems kept me very honest because they were difficult. And anything extraneous was part of the ridiculousness of poetry
Yeah.
and what it can actually do or not. So it was a book that had a lot of skepticism in it. I barely believed it as I was writing it in some ways. Like, am I doing this? Is this worth doing? What's the point of this? And actually, I modified the exercise. The original writing prompt was take a line from Dickinson and try to write something, whether it's a poem or not, who knows, but just try to generate some text. And, 1, 2, 3 lines into the poem, I would lose faith. I would entirely think about how, I would get overwhelmed by how ridiculous what I was doing was, how it was not going to change anything. And I would insert another line from Dickinson, and it would kind of carry me through to the end of the poem. I couldn't have written the book without her. I'm not even entirely sure I would have written again without her. Because I was at this kind of crisis of poetry as just fruitless, pointless activity, which is a strange place for a poet to be.
Yeah.
But the amazing thing about it is something grew out of it, and I do believe that creation can be born from destruction in ways that might on the surface seem difficult or dark or depressing, but there's an inherent joy in it in some ways because something is born.
Right.
There's an energy that's created and released, and in some ways that's the antidote to death, which is the ultimate silence.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially, because your example is it came out of this grief. But I think also a lot of poets just stop writing because they just stop writing. There's some sort of block there, or I don't know, it's really easy to give up on it. What do you think it was that kept you going?
Well, I have to say, I had just gotten this new job as an assistant professor of English, and I was supposed to be a poet.
Yeah.
And I had identified as a human being, as a poet, and was so perplexed at this piece of my identity being torn away from me, in part by myself. But I also realized that, as a child of a Holocaust survivor, as a child whose family had largely been obliterated in the Holocaust, that I was taught to respond to grief with silence. And there are a tremendous amount of silences in my family about the Holocaust. And part of that is because of the lack of information about how various family members died, who just were sort of wiped out of existence. And we don't know what their stories were, but we know they were likely killed in camps such as Terezin, according to the letters we received from the Red Cross. But there were no bodies, there were no gravestones, there were no accounts of how someone died, what exact date it was. And I think that perpetuated a kind of psychic silence in my family. I remember my grandmother and my mother just getting together and crying. They wouldn't talk. They would cry, kvel. And it was a very inarticulate, but very poignant and powerful expression of grief.
Yeah.
And I had been seeing that since I was a little kid. And people like Emily Dickinson, Natasha Trethewey, Mary Jo Bang taught me that you can actually write through grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't modeled that in my family. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that silence was my immediate response. Although I have talked to other writers who have said the same thing to me. They've lost a parent, they've lost a spouse, and they immediately went to silence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this turned out to be a powerful personal experience as well as a powerful creative experience. And I was really in the dark. I did absolutely believe I wasn't going to write again, because I just had come to this point of pointlessness. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think
I got lost along the way.
No, I think it's just something that I've been interested in, and I appreciate your honesty about it, because I think it's really easy to just pretend like you're writing, or to pretend like everything's fine. And I think it's important to have these conversations where we're honest about what's going on with our writing. So
things were definitely not fine.
Yeah.
But I figured out how to write through that place anyway, and to not allow it to silence me.
Yeah.
And I think that I had to reconvince myself of that with every poem, which is why I kept doing the exercise again and again and again. I didn't know how to make any other sound. I didn't know how to write any other poem. And that's why I think they kept coming.
I think you've said that you kind of used Emily Dickinson as a brace, and something you've also said about her is how much you appreciate her keeping it weird or keeping it strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's something I've always appreciated in your work, is the strangeness of it. I was curious if you could talk about how you keep things weird without it feeling artificial, or without it feeling like I'm just doing this to be weird. How do you keep it authentic?
I think one of the questions to ask yourself is if this strangeness is serving the poem and is appropriate for this particular poem, or if the strangeness is obscuring the poem. Mm-hmm. And again, for me, with this book, it felt very chiseled. In a recent essay I wrote, I talked about the poems like being pulled through my teeth. Mm. And I think that sense of pressure and compression on the language made it weird without me even thinking about making it weird. And my own tendency toward, I guess, violence via grief, this carving away and carving away and carving away, was also a way of pulling out extraneous words. The poems to me are intensely musical, and I borrow that from Dickinson. Her music is very strange and jangly. Her music is not it's not perfect. She's the epitome of slant rhyme and off rhyme, and which seemed like a perfect gesture a strained music seemed like the perfect gesture for the elegy.
Mm-hmm.
The music and the strangeness of Dickinson probably infused itself in a way that kept it strange, even though I wasn't trying to do it on purpose.
Yeah.
I can say with my previous books, I don't know that the reader would agree with me, or whatever reader would agree with me, but I try to think of each line in a poem as a poem, and that each line needs to be doing something interesting.
Yeah.
So I challenge myself in that way during my revision process. And it doesn't necessarily need to be syntactic weirdness. It could be, discordant images or sounds that are weird. Um, Metaphors that don't quite line up in some way. And I think that's very much something I pull from my background in painting and art. Um, where you can't, and this also comes by way of Stein, Gertrude Stein. I would have painting professors that would come up to me while I was working on a painting. This is a classic art professor move, and would take it and turn it upside down and tell you to continue. And you know what you want to say in response. But the idea was you can't just pay attention to the objects that you're painting. Every part of the canvas needs to be thought about and considered. Even the background spaces, even the wallpaper. And I've taken that idea into poetry where each line has to be doing something interesting. If it's not, you have to cut it or figure out something to do with it. You can't let one part of your poem be dead.
Yeah.
Then what's the point? I guess those are the things that help me keep it strange. Lullaby with Exit Sign was just strange.
Yeah.
I was a fish out of water. I was very humbled by that book. I didn't know what I was doing, truly. But in the end, I think most of my favorite poems are poems where I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And that discovery, it can be pleasurable and exciting or just interesting and intense. Like, this was a book that felt like work, but that work was necessary. I can't say it was pleasurable, but it was necessary.
Yeah.
I felt driven, once I started, I felt driven to keep going.
Every poem in Lullabies has this weight to it. It has this heft to it. Do you think you have to be able to say, like, this is what this poem means, or this is what this is about? Or do you think that a poem doesn't have to do that?
Oh, I think, some poems might have to do that, but that's a kind of coherence that I don't think I was concerned about as much with Lullaby. I would say I was more interested in providing a sensory rich experience.
Yeah.
Versus, rather than some narrative or some meaning.
Yeah.
It was a kind of electric charge via language, via sound, via imagery, and via the senses, which, the sensory world is always important to me. And again, I think that goes back to, having been a painter and being interested in visual art. But, my father had Lyme disease he had been misdiagnosed several times, and that's why it's hard to say if it was 20 years, 25 years. He had such bizarre symptoms. I remember one time talking to him, and he told me he could feel all of his nerves. He could feel every single one of his nerves, and the nerve endings were burning through his skin. It was just one of the weird sensations he had from the Lyme disease. When he, about 6 months before he died, he had a series of strokes, 4 of them, and one was over the optic center in his brain. And he went blind, but he had periods, I guess, where he thought he could see again. He would have dreams where he could see, and he would wake up and he couldn't see.
Yeah.
And so his sensory world was so scrambled that the delivery of, or the exploration of the sensory world in these poems became important in part because of that.
Yeah.
And then the other piece there is that my mother has in situ melanoma in her face, and she's had, I think it's 24 or 25 surgeries. And the original tumor that was removed was wrapped around the back of her eye. So she almost lost her eye. So there's a lot of poems about sight and sightlessness in the book. But my mother also used to tell me that sometimes she'd be driving and she would have to pull over because this insane, crazy knife, feeling of a knife would shoot through the back of her head. And then it would pass in a few minutes and she'd be fine. And she was told that that was nerves regenerating, coming back to life after, she had had some surgery and then new skin graft on her face. And of course, they were taking skin from her neck and her arm and her leg and behind her ears. So the sensory world is so important to me as a poet. Yeah. And it was really stunning to see my parents go through such sensory torture. So I think in this book, sensory rich experience became really a priority of some kind.
Yeah, it became the meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, on that note, would you like to read some poems?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
Okay, why don't we start with "Dust is the Only Secret" from Lullaby, and then we can kind of work backwards in your timeline.
So this is "Dust is the Only Secret" is a line stolen from Emily Dickinson. Dust is the only secret. Tender father, feather your face, fingers laced with June. This waiting room, white as always, July. You were patient, August, body of wilted springs. Part tissue, part decay, paralysis. September, and the months drip. Patience, pain, infinite contain. Patient between 3 a.m. and Tuesday, between sponge bath and morphine, between warfarin and vomiting. Current, rubber, hiccup, vex. The body lit up, needled, electric. You dream half life, half lit. Machines chirp metallic lullabies. A neon line blinks across a black screen. Pulse like a promise, green and green, until the heart stops, sleeps.
And since you were talking about your painting background, I thought it would be appropriate to read some of the Four Reds poems. They're called Four Reds for Rothko, and this is from the frame called Ruin.
I'd be glad to read the opening. Okay. Of the four. It's called Color Wheel.
Great.
Mix cinnabar and ochre with eggs, then light. Where to go once red lunges into fire. My servile edges aflame sounds as if an end is redly near. How quickly the chemical swallows and peels. Saffron, vermilion, cadmium blue tipped with teeth. Very meditative, also agitative. Fire spins its color wheel, prayer wheel, sequels of fur-lined syntax melt. The flame, a triangle with eyes at the apex and silvery feet. The body, a matchstick house. A house is always burning, breathing commonly hard. I'm advised by specialists to arrange an elaborate fish tank and comfortable leather chair. Watch every day how slowly life moves in another land. Add salt and flakes. Watch every day how slowly life eats. and so full of color.
Beautiful.
My servile edges aflame actually came out of a dream.
I love the sounds. I feel like one thing I notice over and over again in your poems is the ghost words.
I love ghost words.
I know you do. For some reason in Color Wheel in the top line, I thought it said red lungs, and then you read it and it's red lunges, and I totally saw lungs.
Fabulous. But that's great.
Great sounds always in your poetry.
Thank you.
And then if you could, from A Glass of Milk to Kiss Goodnight, which is a book that I reread and reread and reread.
Thank you.
If you could read Loosening the House.
Loosening the house. The typewriter is feminine in French. I grow larger every day. Down the hall, mother and father silently shrink in their sleep. Porcelain bones, cartilage abandoning their knees, and there go the ears and eyes. I dream that they die and think about them flatly. My arms blast the windows, my head ruptures the roof, I crown the tight red sky. A poodle licks my ankles, ice tinkles, bells. Her metal heart and chain, operatic in the metaphoric world. There's death in the trees, little ghosts of yawn and plastic. Snakes in the leaf piles, milk leaking from the eaves.
Was there anything you wanted to read as a surprise poem for us? Did you have anything in mind?
I could read something new.
Yeah, if you want.
Or newish. This should be coming out in Crazy Horse. I don't know, sometime in the next issue or two.
Great.
This is actually from a brand new series of poems I'm working on about objects and body parts.
Okay, great.
Thumb. Who means what it is to be human and is scarred by childhood. Thick and necklace, your head shaped like a gravestone. A smile opens across the knuckle and disappears every time you lift a tumbler of scotch. Who holds a pen and lies? Who holds a chopstick in the language of still twitching fish? When you think of the past, you form a fist until a heart beats. Once removed by a chisel, then reattached. You stiffen in the rain and dream of pudding, a smooth, boneless lake. Who butters morning toast while wearing a butter hat. Who fingers the ad for beef, grows numb while talking to a girl on the phone. Useless while typing, useless tool who only worships space. A stump, a blackened stamp, your own private map of loneliness, who always leans to one side, detached, distant from all others. This is me trying to be funny, by the way.
I was laughing.
Good.
I like the butter hat.
I yanked that couplet at one point.
No.
And my husband was so charmed by it, he begged me to put it back in. And I did.
Thank your husband for us.
Everyone needs a butter hat.
I like the useless too. It's so like emphatic. Useless.
Useless tool. Yeah. Well, it's supposed to be the thing that makes you human, but just because of the way I type, I never use my thumb.
Yeah.
Which I know isn't probably proper. It's supposed to be the space key, right?
I guess so. Just one more question. What's keeping you fresh now, or what are you excited about that you're working on now?
Well, I have been working on this series of object-related poems. I probably have 20, 25 pages. And so I think that that's a manuscript that I'm working toward now. And I have very good company with Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, which is
Mm.
so fun to revisit and revisit. I've been reading it since I was a teenager.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Francis Ponge's Mute Objects of Expression. Um, let's see. Neruda's many odes to objects.
Yeah. Those are
Um,
great.
and then there's also a contemporary poet whose work I like very much, Alice Stager. He's translated by Brian Henry. He has a book called The Book of Things. So these writers are keeping me good company, in similar to how Dickinson did, as I work on these object-related poems, because they've all in one way or another been invested in similar projects.
Mm.
Um, I had some faulty idea that if I started writing about objects, I would be able to remove myself from the emotional intensity of poems like Lullaby with Exit Sign.
Mm.
But half of the poems are about grief and people going missing. And so that stuff's following me around
Yeah.
anyway. But there's also I would say more tonal variety in those poems. So there's butter hats. There's some silliness going
Yeah.
on, which it, I I think being able to laugh with the poem is an enormous gift.
Mm.
As is crying with a poem, but right now for me, the laughter piece is really important.
Yeah.
I'm also reading and rereading folks like Peter Gizzi and Lucy Brock Burrito's Stay Illusion just came out. And so I've gone through it once. I'm going to go back through it again. I always find her use of syntax and diction very stimulating.
Mm.
So I look forward to kind of um, mining her work and mining her vocabulary to see what happens.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I guess don't be afraid to let to be in conversation with writers of all ages, and artists of all kinds.
Yeah.
They've I think the critique of my work, not every single poem I've ever written has to do with art or architecture or Emily Dickinson. And I could see someone saying, oh, her work's derivative in some way. Can't she write a poem on her own? And yes, I can. But I really like to think of art making as a conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm very glad that there are so many other writers and artists and musicians who are exciting to me, who I get to be in conversation with. I guess if I were, I don't know, in closing, I would say be in conversation with people. I think it's good for poems, and it can help people get through those difficult silences.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Beautiful. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Barbara.